The night pressed down on the black shores of Guadalcanal like a lid over a boiling pot. The humid air thick with the smell of wet earth, salt, and rotting palm fronds. When Colonel Masanobu Hara stepped from the landing craft and felt the sand sink under his boots, a sensation he accepted as confirmation of everything he believed about this war. The sea behind him murmured with the steady rhythm of engines shutting down, rifles being checked, whispered orders carried along the tide. Yet his mind was filled only with the quiet arrogance born from years in which the imperial army had moved from triumph to triumph without ever being truly challenged. Malaya had fallen like a curtain pulled down in one motion. Singapore had surrendered in a humiliation the British themselves had believed impossible, and the Philippines had collapsed under the weight of Japanese momentum. Each victory had seemed to whisper the same promise, that spirit, discipline, and will were the only true weapons of war, and that the soft democracies of the West would break long before a Japanese soldier bent his knee. He inhaled the jungle's breath, warm and stale, and told himself that the Americans who had seized this island weeks before were nothing more than an overeager expeditionary force, men who would scatter at the first sign of a bayonet charge delivered with conviction. The darkness around him vibrated with insects and the distant monotonous croak of frogs hidden somewhere in the unseen marshes. Yet beneath those sounds there was something else, a faint metallic echo, almost like a distant hammering. It unsettled some of the younger soldiers, though none dared to say so aloud. They believed the colonel's confidence could push the island itself to obedience. But as Hara advanced inland, the palm fronds brushing his uniform and leaving cool streaks of moisture across his sleeves, he felt the heat shift in a way he did not understand. The air became heavier, pressing against his chest, and the jungle seemed to swallow the columns of men more quickly than he expected, reducing their voices, their movements, even their discipline into something faint and uncertain. Here the night was not a veil granting advantage, it was an adversary of its own, thick with hidden movement and strange, distant rumblings that made no tactical sense. He paused once, listening to a dull thunder rolling from beyond the tree line, not quite realizing that it was the heartbeat of an enemy digging in rather than preparing to flee. For the first time he sensed, without accepting, that the stories brought back from early reconnaissance, stories of Americans who fought stubbornly, who refused to withdraw, who built firing lines with an efficiency that contradicted every assumption the Imperial Army cherished, might not be exaggerations. He shook the thought away and pressed forward, convinced that superiority of spirit would crush whatever fragile resistance waited beyond the ridge. Yet as the night deepened and the jungle swallowed the last traces of moonlight, Hara felt the island watching him with an indifference that bordered on hostility, as if all his old certainties had stepped off the landing craft with him only to dissolve in the heat. And before dawn broke, a realization flickered through him that this place, this forgotten stretch of earth, was preparing to introduce Japan to an enemy far different from the one they had imagined. Dawn on Guadalcanal did not rise with brightness, but with a slow exhalation of heat, as though the island itself were waking in irritation, and Major Daniel Reeves stood at the edge of the unfinished airstrip, a long wound carved into the earth, watching his Marines move like exhausted shadows across the mud. The construction equipment abandoned by the Japanese weeks earlier still lay half buried in the soil, vines creeping over their rusting frames, while the air hummed with mosquitoes so thick that breathing felt like swallowing grit. The men had captured this place with a sudden rush of momentum, storming ashore under the belief that the Navy would be behind them, supplying them, supporting them, protecting them. But that confidence had shattered the night the sea caught fire off Savo Island, when American cruisers burned like floating furnaces and the dark waves carried the screams of sailors into a sky already thick with smoke. When morning came, the Marines realized that they were alone.
not metaphorically, not strategically, but literally abandoned on a hostile island with only the ammunition in their belts and the half-finished runway beneath their boots. Reeves walked the perimeter, boots sinking into mud that clung like hands trying to drag him under, and listened to the strange quiet that settled after weeks of frantic noise. It was not silence. It was something heavier, built from rustling palms, distant surf, the buzzing drone of insects, and the occasional crack of a branch deep inside the jungle, where shapes moved without revealing themselves. He knew those sounds well. They were the sounds of watchers, of enemy scouts slipping between trees, of saboteurs mapping every foxhole and gun pit, preparing for the moment the jungle would swallow the Marines whole. Their men felt it too. They dug trenches until their hands blistered, hauled sandbags until their arms shook, and in every motion lay the unspoken fear that the next night would be the one when the Japanese came pouring out of the darkness like a flood. Their supplies dwindled faster than their strength, the canned rations spoiled in the heat, the drinking water tasted of rusted metal, and bouts of malaria struck without warning, leaving men shivering violently beneath blankets despite the suffocating humidity. Reeves could see hollow eyes and faces smeared with sweat and dust, could hear the scraping of shovels becoming slower each day, could feel morale bending, not breaking, but bending in a way that made the world seem heavier. Yet no one spoke of retreat. No one allowed himself to imagine surrender. The airfield had become more than dirt and timber. It was a lifeline, the only place where American aircraft could land, the only reason the men still believed the Navy might return. At night, they sat in their pits, rifles across their knees, listening to whispers drifting through the tree line. Sometimes it was the shrill call of birds, sometimes the thump of distant drums, sometimes soft movements too deliberate to belong to animals. And each night the tension grew thicker, stretching across the camp like a taut wire ready to snap. Reeves sensed it as keenly as the men did, the feeling that the island was holding its breath, that the enemy hidden in the foliage had begun to gather, that somewhere deep in the jungle a force was preparing itself with slow, methodical patience. And as another oppressive night settled over the airfield, Reeves felt the certainty that the Japanese were no longer watching. They were moving, assembling, and preparing to strike with a ferocity the Marines had only imagined in their darkest thoughts.
Night on Guadalcanal always arrived like a curtain pulled swiftly across the sky, smothering light and sound until the jungle breathed in long, slow exhalations. But on this particular night, the darkness felt unnaturally heavy, charged with an expectation that made every Marine along the perimeter tighten his grip on his rifle. Major Reeves stood behind the forward positions, sweat cooling on his back despite the heat, listening to the distant rustle of palms bending beneath a wind that did not exist. The air was thick enough to drink, and even the insects seemed to falter, their constant droning fading into a suffocating stillness. Somewhere out there was Colonel Ichiki's vanguard, a force shaped by years of triumph, convinced that one decisive charge would send the Americans running for the boats they no longer had. Ichiki believed the island belonged to Japan by destiny. Reeves believed the island belonged to whoever survived the night. When the first Japanese scouts appeared, they did so without sound, slipping between tree trunks like shadows escaping from the forest floor. Their silhouettes flickered at the edge of the wire, lean bodies crouched low, blades glinting faintly whenever a cloud thinned enough for starlight to break through. Reeves watched through binoculars, his breath steady, and saw the telltale moment when those shadows stiffened, the silent signal drifting backward through the foliage. A heartbeat later, a shout erupted, not a single voice, but a wave of them, a rising cry that seemed torn from the earth itself. "Banzai!"
rolled across the dark plain like a shockwave, and the jungle vomited forth a mass of bodies sprinting through the open ground, faces contorted in a feverish mix of discipline and desperation. The Marines did not scatter. They did not flinch. They waited until the shapes emerged far enough from the tree line, until the rushing figures became fully visible in the dim glow of distant flares. Then the American line ignited. Machine guns spat threads of red that cut the darkness into ribbons, rifles cracked with ruthless rhythm, and mortars thumped behind the trenches, their arcs invisible until explosions tore open the earth beneath the charging men. The contrast was brutal. Wild momentum against cold precision, belief against steady engineering, old doctrine slamming into new reality so violently that the air itself seemed to twist under the pressure. Ichiki's soldiers pressed forward anyway, stepping over bodies, pushing their comrades ahead, convinced that sheer determination could overcome mathematics. But every yard of ground grew more expensive, every charge bent beneath the weight of concentrated fire. Reeves saw Marines who had been trembling with fever an hour earlier, now firing with grim efficiency, saw gunners soaking their barrels with canteens to keep them from melting, saw the wave of attackers shudder, break, reform, and then break again. The cries of Banzai turned ragged, turning into fragmented shouts swallowed by smoke and dust. By the time the attack dissolved into scattered movement, Reeves knew the truth even before the shouting died away. This had not been a test. It had been a revelation. The Japanese had believed the Americans incapable of standing firm in the face of a massed assault. Instead, they had met it with a discipline that bordered on merciless. What Ichiki had intended as a swift, glorious annihilation had become a slaughter his superiors would struggle to comprehend. And as dawn crept over the blood-soaked plain, a wounded runner from Ichiki's shattered battalion staggered toward the jungle, carrying news so unbelievable that Tokyo would reject it before accepting that something fundamental had changed on Guadalcanal.
The ridge rose from the tangled jungle like a spine of ancient bone, narrow, uneven, and exposed to every shifting breath of the wind that carried the scent of mud, cordite, and the faint sweetness of crushed vegetation. Major Reeves stood at its crest in the fading light of late afternoon, feeling the ground vibrate beneath the steady march of exhaustion that had consumed his Marines. The men had dug foxholes in soil that felt more like clay than earth, their trenches twisting along the ridge in a line so thin it looked fragile enough to crumble under a sudden rain. Below them, the jungle swelled in green waves, leaves trembling not with breeze but with movement, silent, patient, methodical movement as Japanese troops worked their way through the undergrowth, preparing for a blow that Reeves knew would come not with warning, but with the abrupt violence of a storm breaking open the night. The ridge offered little comfort. Too narrow for retreat, too steep for quick reinforcement, it forced the Marines to stand shoulder to shoulder in cramped pits where sweat dripped endlessly from brows and rifles felt heavier with each passing hour. Men coughed quietly, their breaths thick with humidity, while the metallic taste of anticipation clung to their tongues. The paratroopers who had joined him, lean, sunken-eyed from weeks of fighting, spoke seldom, their presence adding to the grim understanding that whatever was coming would not resemble previous skirmishes. This would be the main thrust, the attempt to tear the ridge apart and sweep through to the airfield beyond, the attempt to crush the Americans before they could become anything more than an unexpected inconvenience. Night arrived like a great weight dropped over the ridge, and at first there was only the slow breathing of the jungle, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant crash of waves breaking against a reef that none of them could see. Then a single flare arced upward, painting the sky in a pale white glow that turned every leaf below into a blade of polished steel. For a moment the jungle froze, held in a breathless tableau, and then it erupted. The Japanese attacked in waves, not chaotic surges like at Alligator Creek, but coordinated assaults shaped by discipline, driven by desperation. Machine guns mounted on the ridge rattled in long, trembling bursts, stitching lines of fire across the advancing shapes, while mortars fired from the rear thumped rhythmically, shaking dust from branches overhead.
Reeves shouted orders drowned instantly by the roar of battle. Flares burst one after another, bathing the ridge in alternating shadows and searing brightness that made the world flicker like a broken lantern. Japanese soldiers threw themselves into gaps in the line, forcing brutal, intimate combat where bayonets scraped bone and the earth was slick beneath boots. Twice the line bent, once it nearly shattered. Reeves saw a group of attackers breach the center, leaping into foxholes, their silhouettes flashing like ghosts against the burning sky. Marines met them at arm's length, rifles thrust like spears, fists hammering skulls when ammunition ran dry. Hours dragged with no meaning, measured only by the number of times the ridge trembled beneath the weight of another charge. The jungle echoed with cries, some sharp with pain, some guttural with rage, some fading into the night like breath on glass. Men fought until their hands cramped, until their eyes burned, until their legs trembled beneath them, and still the Japanese came, driven by a command that demanded victory at any cost. Near dawn, as the last flare flickered weakly and shadows stretched across the ridge, the attacks finally slowed. The jungle grew quiet again, but not peacefully. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of bodies lying where they had fallen, of men too drained to speak. Reeves looked over his battered perimeter, smoke curling from shattered trees, and saw that the ridge still belonged to them, not because it had been easy, and not because they had been spared, but because the men had refused to break. And as he listened to the jungle groan beneath the weight of its dead, Reeves understood that this night had proven something far greater than endurance. It had shown the world that the Americans could not only survive the assault, but return it with a ferocity Japan had not expected, a revelation that would echo through every decision still to come.
October crept onto Guadalcanal not with cool winds or a change in sky, but with a deepening heaviness that settled over every foxhole and trench like an invisible fog, the kind that pressed into men's lungs and made each breath feel borrowed. Major Reeves sensed the shift before the first reports arrived. The jungle had grown louder in strange ways, trembling under the passage of unseen columns, and the nights carried echoes of engines and the muted clatter of metal striking metal. Japan was gathering its strength, not remnants, not scattered detachments, but the best troops they could pull from the crumbling edges of their expanding war. Veterans hardened by campaigns across Asia, soldiers drilled to advance even when the ground beneath them ran red. Tokyo believed this month would decide the island. Reeves believed it too. The Marines, worn thin by months of privation, prepared with a kind of grim, practical fatalism. Their uniforms hung loose on bodies ravaged by malaria. Their boots were patched with scraps. Their food rations tasted of mold and iron. Yet they fortified every ridge, checked every line of fire, dug deeper trenches and reinforced machine gun nests that seemed laughably small compared to the storm they knew was coming. The airfield, Henderson Field, lay behind them like a silent witness, its runway shimmering under the sun, each sortie flown from it carved into their memory as a promise that help might still come from the sky even when the sea abandoned them. The attacks began from 3 directions at once, as if the jungle itself had splintered into converging storms. Japanese artillery, dragged through impossible terrain, hammered the perimeter with a fury Reeves had never heard before, the explosions shaking the very bones of the island. Infantry surged behind the bombardment, moving with a relentless determination that made them seem tireless, though Reeves knew how desperate their commanders had become. Then came the tanks, low, boxy machines with engines that roared like wounded animals as they lurched forward through mud and broken palms. For a moment, the Marines wavered, their small-caliber weapons seeming pitiful against steel. But they steadied themselves, dug their heels into the dirt, and aimed with a precision born of terror and necessity. Near the southern edge of the airfield, where the line had grown dangerously thin, stood Sergeant William Carver, a man whose face had hollowed so sharply from disease that he looked carved from the same dust he knelt in. His machine gun, an aging, temperamental weapon, repaired more with tape and wire than actual parts, had become the final hinge in the defense.
Carver and the two gaunt Marines beside him had not slept in nearly 2 days. Their ammunition was stacked in trembling piles, their canteens empty, their bodies shaking with equal parts fear and exhaustion. Yet when the tanks broke through the outer line and infantry followed, screaming with the fevered conviction of men promised victory or death, Carver did not move. He pressed the trigger, and the gun erupted in a long, unbroken roar that drowned out the night. Rounds clattered into the weapon's smoking chamber. Spent casings fell like brass rain across his boots. The barrel glowed red, the metal warping, the sound growing hoarse as if the weapon itself were dying with each burst. At one point, the gun jammed, and Carver tore at it blindly, fingers burnt raw, clearing the blockage by instinct rather than vision. When it fired again, he screamed, not in rage, but from the sheer pain of forcing his battered body to continue. Behind him, the airfield lay silent. Ahead of him, the jungle writhed with bodies. Around him, the world narrowed to a single belief: he could not let the line fall. The Japanese pushed until their momentum dissolved into smoke and wreckage. One tank burned so fiercely that its flames split the night like a second sunrise. The infantry, cut into fragments by overlapping fields of fire, staggered, broke, and finally receded into the shadowed undergrowth. And when the echoes of battle finally faded, Reeves understood something the enemy had not wished to believe: that Japan had wagered the strength of its finest soldiers on this month and lost, and the balance of the Pacific had begun to tilt in a direction that no force on earth would easily reverse. By December, Guadalcanal no longer felt like an island contested by armies, but a vast, open graveyard where the jungle itself seemed to grieve. The once ferocious crack of rifles and the pounding thunder of artillery had dwindled into occasional, hollow echoes, easily swallowed by the dense canopy. Major Reeves walked the perimeter one humid morning and sensed not triumph, but a heavy, almost sacred stillness. The Americans still dug, patrolled, and reinforced positions out of habit, yet they understood the truth whispered through every rustling palm. Japan's war machine, which had roared across Asia like an unbroken tide, had begun to rot here, collapsing from within before it ever fully conceded defeat in battle. The Tokyo Express, once a nightly terror with destroyers racing down the slot under a shroud of darkness, now sputtered like a dying engine. Ships that broke through delivered gaunt soldiers whose eyes had sunk deep into skulls, men too weak to carry rifles, some unable to stand without leaning on the railings as they disembarked. Starvation crept through the Japanese ranks with the persistence of a living thing. Rice rations had shrunk to handfuls, sometimes mere spoonfuls, and men scavenged berries, roots, anything not immediately poisonous. Reeves saw abandoned Japanese shelters during patrols, crude huts built of palm leaves, with the floor littered in fish bones, scraps of leather boots chewed down to the stitching, and torn pages of diaries written in trembling characters that spoke of hunger, fever, and a desperate longing for home. Disease ravaged them: malaria, dysentery, beriberi, no longer adversaries but executioners. Many Japanese soldiers no longer died from bullets. They died curled beneath trees, their bodies folding into the soil as if the island itself were reclaiming them. And still their officers demanded attacks that never came, clinging to orders from distant headquarters that refused to accept the campaign had already slipped beyond salvation. The myth of Japan's unmatched superiority, forged through years of stunning victories, lay buried beneath the humid soil alongside thousands of men who had once believed themselves unstoppable. Guadalcanal had not just consumed soldiers, it had consumed illusions. For Japan, it marked the moment the war's momentum slipped through their fingers, impossible to reclaim. For the Americans, it revealed a truth they had not fully known about themselves: that endurance, discipline, and stubborn refusal to break could bend the arc of a global conflict. As Reeves watched the sun rise over Henderson Field, its surface shimmering like a scar that had healed without forgetting, he understood that the story of this island would echo far beyond the Pacific. For on Guadalcanal, two truths were buried: the myth of Japan's unmatched superiority and the doubt that America possessed the strength to decide the future of the war, a doubt that would never return.